Welcome to Management 2020. The goal of this video is to talk about words and word parts. So first we'll talk about this idea of prescriptive versus descriptive grammar, and then dig into the topic of morphology, and talk about word choice, synonyms, antonyms, affixes, root stems, and spelling patterns, and talk about how technology impacts our knowledge and our use of vocabulary. So I just want to talk a little bit about this concept of prescriptive versus descriptive approaches to grammar. Linguists will sometimes say the worst someone can do is take one grammar course. And what can happen sometimes is when people know a little bit of grammar, they can become very strict about applying rules of grammar, not only to themselves, but to other people, and maybe say tell other people what is correct or incorrect grammar. That would be a prescriptivist approach. This idea of prescribing, right? We've said here are the rules of the language, and everyone must follow the rules of the language. Um, the problem with that, well, one of the problems with that is that what is the right form of English? There's so many forms of English, and often what becomes maybe a national standard is a standard imposed on the populace by the people in control, the people who have money, the people who have power. Um, and so we need to be careful not to allow that to be the only viable option in English. So a descriptivist approach, which most trained linguists will take up to grammar, is trying to understand how are people using grammar and trying to understand the choices they make and how their uses of grammar may be different from someone else's. In that sense, we don't necessarily judge grammar as being right or wrong. We just understand that it's different depending on the situation or context. And we've talked about register before, and so that different registers may have different standards or patterns for different grammatical structures. So I bring this up to say that in business writing, we have to find a balance between these two. We can't just say anything goes grammar because we know that grammar and vocabulary choices impact how people perceive our language. And thus that impacts the relationship that we can have with them, how they view the organizations that we represent. But at the same time, we want to be careful not to become strict prescriptivists by saying that there's only one way to use grammar. The reality is language changes. English is changing all the time. And so we can't say that this is the only way to do this. We can say that this is maybe the most common or accepted way in this context, but recognize that things are going to change over time. So in our course, we're trying to find a balance between these two, understand what are the most common and accepted patterns for business and workplace contexts, but also recognize that variation is okay and there's nothing wrong with that. And there isn't any true correct answer. There's just more appropriate responses than others. So let's talk about morphology. Really, business communicators don't need to know the word morphology. I'm just introducing it's a linguistic concept and it just means the study of word and word parts. Why do we need to know about morphology? Well, we don't need to know the term, except that the more we know about words and word parts, the better choices we can make about how to use words appropriately and effectively. So, as we've talked about, register is a result, or changes in register or style or tone are all about making choices in the words we use and the grammar or the sentence structures we use. And different choices in those can impact our register, how it's perceived by our audience. So we know what are good choices of words to use and which words would not be appropriate to use. There are lots of commonly confused words in English. And so your textbook has some good lists. We can practice with activities to recognize some of these commonly misunderstood words and better memorize and understand the distinction between these words. But often, the kinds of words that are commonly confused are words that are homophones. So words that sound either the same or similar, and then they get used in the wrong way, like two, and two and there and there. But even other words that are not maybe exact homophones, but are similar, like accept and accept. So one of the dangers of using technology like autocorrect and spell check is that we might just accept the choice it gives us when we do autocorrect, but it might be choosing the wrong word. And so we need to know enough about commonly confused words and word choice so that if technology is suggesting some changes to us, we're smarter than the technology and we know which word to choose. And maybe the choice it's giving us is the wrong choice and we need to override it. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, go back to the textbook chapter and more carefully look at the word choice sections. Okay, let's talk about antonyms and synonyms. I'm sure that these are words that you've come across before in other language arts or English courses. So antonyms are words that have opposite meaning. Synonyms are words that I would say have similar meaning. Sometimes they're described as words that have the same meaning, but in a sense, no two words ever have the same meaning. Even the same word can have different meanings for different people because our culture, our own personal life experiences shape our perception of words. Um, and so we need to understand that. We need to understand this connotation. Our emotions and our cultural connections to words impact how we feel about words. We may have a positive feeling about a word, but if our audience doesn't have that positive connection, maybe even has a negative connection to that word, then are we writing for ourselves or are we writing for our audience? We might have to change the words we use in order to effectively reach our audience and communicate our message to them. So, a lot of this involves understanding our audience and how they perceive our words, interacting with our audience, getting to know them, and their interactions with language can help us use language effectively to interact with them and communicate with them. Now, I've also added this line here about precision versus variety. I want to share a short story. A graduate school friend of mine later went on to law school. And when she was in law school, the feedback almost her first semester she got from one of her professors was that she was a really good writer, but she wasn't precise. That she would use a word and then in the next sentence or the next paragraph, she'd use a synonym for that word. And my friend was a good writer, had lots of vocabulary, was very creative with language, but she says that's not what we want in law. We don't want creative language. It's not a creative writing profession generally. We need to be precise. And so she said, when you use a word, you need to use that word again throughout the text so that we understand that you're talking about the same thing. So this can happen as well in the business field when we're writing policy or we're writing important documents where clarity is really important. Sometimes that variety of language, choosing different words, which can be great for marketing, can be great for creative writing, is not great when we want to be precise and clear. We might need to be a little bit redundant and use a particular word multiple times so that we're not confusing our audience and that they know that we're talking about the same idea throughout the text. Now let's talk about affixes. Affix might be a new word for you, but prefix and suffix isn't. So affix is just a more umbrella term that means prefixes and suffixes. Some languages also have something called an infix, okay? Kind of a word part that gets put in the middle of the word. English doesn't really do this except for maybe an example like abso-frickin-lutely. Okay? We put that affix or other variations of that affix in the middle of words to provide emphasis to a word. But other than that, English just uses prefixes and suffixes. Prefixes and suffixes are ways that can help us communicate more complex ideas within one word instead of having to use multiple words. And they're also a way that we can use to help create um, coherence in a piece of writing. So I've written here this idea of nominalization of verbs. So maybe I'm writing something and I have a sentence like the team recommended something. And then I want to make reference to that. And if I use very different words, people might not know that I'm talking about the same thing that I just mentioned in the sentence. But I could use a variation of that verb and turn it into a noun and say, based on this recommendation, and now people know that there's a connection there. The word's not the exact same word. I used it as a verb, and then I converted it using a suffix to turn it into a noun. But this is creating that cohesion or making a cohesive text so that the readers are understanding that I'm talking about the same thing, even though I'm using different grammar. This is a good strategy to use to help keep your writing cohesive. Knowledge of affixes, roots, and stems can also help us predict the meaning of words. So, for example, the word synergize. This is, I think, when I was doing my undergrad, this was becoming a more popular word in the business world. And some people would criticize it, like, you just invented a new word. Well, English does this all the time. There's nothing wrong with doing this, but we have to understand what the word means. And to some degree, our knowledge of word parts could help us, right? Syn can mean similar or together or with. Not that many of us know this part, but the erg part can mean work or effort. And then the eyes is a suffix that can turn something into a verb. So we have this verb here that means the action of bringing work or energy together, synergizing. Here are some other affixes that are common in business communication. These ones are prefixes, okay? D, like de-recruitment, de-layer. These are newer words, okay? Re means to do it again, so reorg or re-onboard. A pre, a pre-negotiate or a pre-market release or pre-market research. And then inter can mean between, but usually between things externally. So interdepartmental or intercompany. And then intra means within something. So intranet, this would be a network system within maybe an organization. Or intra engagement. This is a newer word I've come across in business articles, and it means internal motivation for wanting to be engaged in your job. We also have some suffixes that are more commonly used in business communication than maybe everyday English, like the preneur. Okay, it used to just be the word entrepreneur, but now people have taken this and used that preneur suffix to make things like a solopreneur or an infopreneur. In my field, for the past year, I've seen this new word appear called a teacherpreneur, people who go and become independent teachers. Wise, this isn't a especially new one, but budget wise or profit wise. Okay, turns things into more adjectives. And then we've already talked about this a little bit, the shun, or well, like implementation or creditation. This things into nouns. Mint, okay, turns things into a noun process like alignment, deployment, procurement, and ability like scalability, usability, profitability. Here's a word that I recently came across in a business writing publication, interoperability. So I want you to use, and if you want, you can pause the video for a moment, use your knowledge of word parts to maybe guess at the meaning of this word. Okay, now we know that inter, we already talked about this one, means between things. Okay, oper, like operate, okay, has to do with work, function, labor, doing things. And then ability is the capacity to do something. So interoperability is trying to describe the degree that things are compatible to work together. So we may be talking about software or other kinds of systems. What is their interoperability? A new word, but our knowledge of new word parts can help us predict the meaning of this word. Lastly, I want to talk here a little bit about spelling patterns. One, we've talked that learning business in English is like learning a new language in a sense. And one of the um, qualities of good language learners is their ability to notice language, to pay attention to the patterns or the rules or changes in language. This is called the noticing hypothesis. And researchers have um, found evidence that those who are good at noticing language, not just using language, but thinking about language and paying attention to how language works, are better at learning the language. So when you are reading and writing and consuming business texts, I encourage you to look for patterns. Look for patterns in spelling. Look for other kinds of patterns as well, but spelling patterns. This can help you learn words and become a better, more efficient, independent speller. In the age of computers and technology, I think a lot of us have become maybe dependent on spell checkers or spell check, autocorrect to spell words for us. We just get something approximate and we hope that the computer will fix it for us. And yeah, maybe we're always going to be writing on computers and maybe we'll always have these tools to help us. But do we want to be dependent on technology or do we want to use technology as a tool to help us? And so the better we are at noticing language and learning spelling patterns on our own, then we can use these tools without being dependent on these tools. So in our video, we talked a little bit about finding that balance between prescriptivist grammar and descriptivist. And then we talked about a variety of different aspects of morphology and how our understanding of words, word patterns, word parts can help make us better business communicators. I hope this video has been helpful to helping you understand a little bit more about your responsibility, but also your power to use words effectively in a business context.